G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Joshua. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. This study has been taken from a commentary prepared by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of RL Ministries Worldwide. Thank you again. So here we are, we're into session 7. Last session, we finished off with, remember, the anti-Gibeonite League. 5 kings got together. Adonizedek, who's the king of Jerusalem, he realized that Gibeon has gone over to the side of Israel, made a treaty with them, and they're a large army, so he decided that, hey, we've got to try and knock Gibeon out of the way before Israel starts coming against us. So these 5 kings in the area aligned themselves against Gideon and then what we see here is that they were fearful because Gibeon was very strong, so an alliance of these 5 kings got together to come against him, to make war against him. Now Gibeon now calls out to Joshua because remember they had made a covenant with Israel, deceptively, but they did make a covenant, and Joshua keeps his word. And Joshua came to their aid, and we have the divine message from God to Joshua. It says, fear them not, don't worry about them, because I've delivered them into your hands. And we have a surprise attack. Why? Because Joshua, remember, he marched all night to come against this alliance of kings. There's a big march uphill all the way. And God caused a great confusion amongst these kings, and those who weren't slaughtered fled, and then they were pursued by the Israelites. But in the pursuit, God again intervened by hurling great hailstones upon these fleeing armies and upon the area where they were being chased by the Israelites. But not one hailstone hit an Israelite. They only hit the Amorites, so no Israelites were touched. In fact, more Amorites were killed by hailstones than by sword. Okay, so let's move into this session. So we're going to see another miracle now. We're going to see the miracle of the long day. And this is chapter 10, verse 12 to 15. We're still into the central campaign here, which is going to take us down to chapter 10, verse 43. Now in verse 12, we have the prayer of Joshua. And the timing is, it says, then spake Joshua to Jehovah in the day when Jehovah delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. So we had the prayer, and he said, in the sight of Israel, sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou, moon, in the valley of Ajalon. Now, in verse 13, we have the divine answer. And the miracle is, and the sun stood still, and the moon stayed. So the timing, it was until the nation had avenged themselves of their enemies, and their source and the sources is the source is not this written in the book of Joshua. This is a book which we can't find it. So this is a source also mentioned in 2 Samuel 1:18. It's a source that is no longer available to us. And the result is, and the sun stayed in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. Now, then verse 14 spells out the uniqueness of this event. First of all, uniqueness of the day. There was no day like that before or after it. And then we have the uniqueness of the means. And the fact is that Jehovah hearkened unto the voice of a man. So the basis for God's response is that he was fighting for Israel. It says, for Jehovah fought for Israel. And then in verse 15 we have the conclusion of the day. And Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, unto the camp to Gilgal. Now, this long day, there are 5 views regarding the miracle of the long day. The first view is based on the Hebrew word for stand still, which is dom, D-O-M. Some claim that the term should be rendered as leave off or cease. You see it in 2 Kings 4:6, and Lamentations 2:18. Now, if it's translated this way, Joshua's prayer for the sun to stand still would be a request for relief from the blazing down on the Jewish troops. And the large hailstorm would be viewed as the answer to that prayer. And this interpretation is simply trying to get around the miracle and not accepting the text as it is written. Remember, for some reason, Christians want to try and explain away miracles. Not sure why. The second view is that since Joshua attacked early in the morning, he prayed for the sun to hold off and for semi-darkness to continue and the hailstorm that would have blocked the sun rays were the answer to that prayer. But this too seems to be a view that is trying to avoid this being a true miracle of incredible magnitude, because it was. And therefore, the first two views are not tenable by Bible believers, by those who take the Bible literally, that is. Third view is that the sun and moon were Canaanite deities, and yet they had to obey the God of Israel because he was their creator. That also cannot be biblically defended. The fourth view is that God actually restrained or halted the earth's rotation while the sun was above Joshua, making the rotation of the earth last for 48 hours rather than 24 hours. And there are parallels in ancient histories and cultures that speak of a long day. Now, the text itself states only that the sun stayed in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. That's verse 13. Now, the phrase hasted not could mean a retardation of the movement, so that the rotation required a longer period of time to rotate but did not stop completely. Now, and this is one valid view to be held by those who take the Bible literally and seriously. And the fifth view is that there was no slowing of the earth's rotation, but there was a local miracle that took place in which the rays of the sun, were in some way extended to the battlefield for 48 hours. And this would be very similar to the miracle of the shadow on the sundial for Hezekiah. If you know Hezekiah, that's found in 2 Kings 20 verse 8 to 11, 2 Kings 28 to 11, and Isaiah 38 7 to 8. Isaiah 38 7 to 8. That's when the shadow moved backwards from sundial. Okay. Now, this interpretation does not require the earth to either stop rotating or to slow down. Although such a miracle is not viewed as being impossible with God, he can do whatever he wants. It's simply thought that while the earth kept on rotating at its normal speed, for some reason the sun rays extended in some way for 48 hours onto a certain area, which is the battlefield. And while this interpretation is also a valid view held by Bible believers, it's simply best just to take the text as it is written. It happened. We just can't fully explain it. It's miraculous. Now, verses 16 to 21 now. This follows the law of recurrence, remember, which is a principle found throughout scriptures. An event is recorded in 2 or more versions. The second time it is told, additional detail is now provided. So the story of the conquest provides an example of this law of recurrence. We're going to get back over it, adding some more detail. So this is the discovery of the kings in verses 16 to 21. Verse 16 is the hiding of the kings. These are the kings who are fleeing from Joshua and the Israelites with the big chase. First of all is the flight we see, and these 5 kings fled. And then the second thing is the hiding. It says they hid themselves in the cave at Makkedah. And then in verse 17, we have the report to Joshua. And it was told Joshua, saying, hey, the 5 kings are found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. And then in verses 18 to 19, it focuses now on Joshua's response to the report, with verse 18 revealing his instructions. And Joshua said, roll great stones onto the mouth of the cave and set men by it to keep them. What's this for? Well, blocking the exit of the cave would keep the kings from escaping while Joshua finished the pursuit of the Canaanites. He's going to come back to these guys. And then in verse 19 is the pursuit. But stay not ye, pursue after your enemies and smite the hindmost of them. Suffer them not to enter into their cities, for Jehovah your God has delivered them into your hand. So now, Joshua pointed out the responsibility of his troops. Rather than stopping, they were to pursue their enemies, attack them from the rear, make sure that they did not reach their fortified cities, where it would have been much harder to destroy them. The divinely promised victory must now be delayed, since God was using human means to accomplish it. And then in verses 20 to 21, we have the conclusion of the battle. Verse 20 is the battle, and first of all, it deals with the slaughter. And it came to pass, when Joshua and the children of Israel had made an end of slaying them with a very great slaughter, till they were consumed, and the remnant which remained of them had entered into the fortified cities. So the Israelites defeated most of the Canaanites, and those who escaped actually got into their fortified cities and hid. So these would be attacked by Israel later in the chapter. And then in verse 21, Joshua and his men now returned to Makkedah, that all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. None moved his tongue against any other children of Israel. The victory of the Israelites was so great that it caused respect in the land, caused fear. No one uttered a word against them. Now, very similar expression found in Exodus 11:7. Exodus 11:7. Let me read it for you. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast. So this was an idiom showing that no one showed any hostility toward Israel because they were fearful of them. And then we see moving on into we see the execution of the kings in verses 22 to 27. Sounds like hail outside. The 5 Canaanite kings had begun the revolt against the Israelites and their allies in verses 3 to 5. And since then, they've now been captured in the cave. In verse 22, we have the command of Joshua. Then said Joshua, open the mouth of the cave, bring forth those 5 kings unto me out of the cave. And then in verse 23, we have the obedience of Joshua's men. And they did so, and brought forth those 5 kings unto him out of the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon. So verse 24 records the humbling of the 5 kings, beginning with Joshua's command. And it came to pass, when they brought forth those kings unto Joshua, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said unto the chiefs of the men of war that went with him, come near, put your feet upon the necks of these kings. And this is followed by the obedience of Joshua's men. It says they came near and put their feet upon the necks of these kings, these kings. What does this do? Well, this action symbolized the complete subjection of the enemy. And then in verse 25, we have the encouragement of Joshua. And Joshua said unto them, fear not, nor be dismayed. Be strong and of good courage. The basis is the divine promise. For thus shall Jehovah do to all your enemies against whom you fight. What Joshua is telling his people is God would subjugate all of Israel's enemies. And then we see in verse 26, we have the execution of the kings. It comes in 2 stages. First stage, and afterward Joshua smote them and put them to death. And the second stage we see in the second part of verse 26. And he hanged them on 5 trees, and they were hanging upon the trees until the evening. In verse 27, we now deal with the burial of the kings. It came to pass at the time of the going down of the sun that Joshua commanded, and they took them down off the trees, and they cast them into the cave wherein they had hidden themselves, and laid great stones on the mouth of the cave unto this very day. Well, remember, the phrase unto this very day simply refers to the day the book was written, all right? Not to this very day today. Now we see the conquest of these cities. The kings are gone, now we're going to conquer the cities. And this is in verse 28 to 29. First up, we see the city of Makkedah, verse 28. The execution of the 5 Canaanite kings and the defeat of their armies was now followed by the conquest of their cities in a series of quick raids, which we're going to see in verses 28 to 29. It begins in verse 28. It's a statement of capture. Oh, that should be 28 to 39, I think. And Joshua took Makkedah on that day and smote it with the edge of the sword, and the king thereof. On the same day that Joshua executed the 5 kings at the cave of Makkedah, he captured the city of Makkedah. And second comes a statement of the destruction. He utterly destroyed them and all the souls that were therein. He left none remaining, and he did to the king of Makkedah as he had done unto the king of Jericho. Now, the statement of destruction here reveals that he left no survivors. And in the verse then makes a comparison, saying that Joshua did to the king of Makkedah as he had done to the king of Jericho. Well, back in chapter 6, it didn't state how the king of Jericho died, but this verse says that he died in battle, according to this verse. Now we move on to the city of Libnah. Verse 29 to 30. Verse 29, we see the attack. Here we have a statement, a bit of a transition here. And Joshua passed from Makkedah and all Israel with him onto Libnah. So they traveled down, followed by a short statement regarding the battle itself, and fought against Libnah. Verse 30 shows the capture of the city by divine aid. And Jehovah delivered it also, and the king thereof into the hand of Israel. So this is now followed by the destruction of the population. And he smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein, he left none remaining in it. And the verse concludes with the comparison. And he did unto the king thereof as he had done unto the king of Jericho. Now we come to the city of Lachish, 31 to 32. And this describes the capture. In verse 31, we see the attack. And Joshua passed, so he's left Libnah and all Israel with him unto Lachish. And then comes the battle, and he encamped against it and fought against it. Verse 32 is the capture. Again, we see the divine aid. And Jehovah delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel, and he took it on the second day. Now, all the other cities were captured in one day. But due to the strength of Lachish, it took 2 days to conquer the city. And so the account of the capture of Lachish is followed by the destruction of its population. It says he smote it with the edge of the sword and all the souls that were therein. And then the verse now concludes with the comparison. According to all that he had done to Libnah. So every city he's doing this to them. And then we see now the army of Gezer in verse 33. So the next city to be captured was Gezer. And this account begins in verse 33 with the attack by Gezer, right? It says, then Horan, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish. Now this is the only account of one city-state coming to the aid of another city-state while there was a war in progress. And this action took place while Lachish was under siege, which might explain why it took 2 days to capture Lachish. However, Gezer's decision to support Lachish only led to the defeat of the army of Gezer. And Jehovah smote him and his people until he had left him none remaining. Now, this is in reference to the army only. The city itself was not captured and remained under Canaanite control until the time of King Solomon. He just killed all the army. And we come to the city of Eglon in verses 34 to 35. In verse 34, we have the attack. And Joshua passed from Lachish. He's just been at Lachish for 2 days. He passed from Lachish and all Israel with him onto Eglon. And then we have the battle. And they encamped against it and fought against it. And then verse 35 is the capture and the destruction. And they took it on that day and smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein he utterly destroyed that day. As in the previous accounts, the verse ends in a comparison, according to all that he had done to Lachish. So he's just comparing this latest city with the previous city. So the capture of Eglon completes the conquest of the Shephelah, and now Joshua moved to the hill country of Judah. And we're going to go to the city of Hebron in verses 36 to 37. Beginning in verse 36, we see now Joshua went up from Eglon. He's left Eglon. He's now and all Israel with him. He's come down onto Hebron, and they fought against it. And verse 37 is the destruction. And they took it and they smote it with the edge of the sword, and the king thereof and all the cities thereof. All the cities thereof means all the nearby towns which were unwalled under the jurisdiction of Hebron. So they weren't within the walls, and they were just local towns nearby. And it says, and all the souls that were therein he left none remaining. Again, all the cities thereof refers to nearby unwalled towns that were under the jurisdiction of Hebron. Now, the account now concludes with a comparison, once again, a comparison. According to all that he had done to Eglon, but he utterly destroyed it and all the souls that were therein. So Joshua captured Hebron as he had captured the city of Eglon, and he destroyed all its citizens. Debir is the next city. This is the last city the Israelites captured in this campaign. We see it in verse 38 to 39. Beginning in verse 38 with the transition, and Joshua returned and all Israel with him to Debir and fought against it. And verse 39, we see he took it and the king thereof and all the cities thereof. And then in the second part of 39, we see the destruction of the population being described. And they smote them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed all the souls that were therein. He left none remaining. So he's leaving nobody alive. And the account ends now with a comparison. Verse 39, see, as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir, and to the king thereof, as he had done also to Libnah, and to the king thereof. Now, the fall of Debir completes the conquest of the hill country of Judah with the exception of the city of Jerusalem. That hasn't been taken yet. Now, this is a central campaign we've been doing, a bit of a summary of the central campaign. Verses 40 to 42 summarize the extent of Israel's campaign in the south of Canaan, beginning in verse 40 with the list of the geographical divisions. So Joshua smote all the land, the hill country in the south, and the lowland and the slopes, and all their kings. He left none remaining, but he utterly destroyed all that breathed as Jehovah the God of Israel commanded. The hill country includes both the hill country of Ephraim and the hill country of Judah. The term south refers to the Negev, and then comes the lowland, meaning the Shephelah. Finally, there are the slopes, meaning the hillsides that descend sharply into the Jordan Valley. And besides the land, Joshua also subdued all of its kings and destroyed the entire population. Now, this action was the application of the Kerem curse. Remember, Kerem curse, devoted to destruction. We saw that back in Jericho. And its basis was God's command. In verse 41, we're given the summary of the borders. And Joshua smote them from Kadesh Barnea even unto Gaza, and all the country of Goshen even unto Gibeon. Kadesh Barnea and Gaza marked the southern border, and Goshen and Gibeon the northern border. Now, this only lists the territory captured as of chapter 10, because that's where we are, and not what will yet be taken coming up in chapter 11. Verse 42 stresses the divine aid and the success. And all these kings and their land did Joshua take at one time, because Jehovah, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. There's a little bit of a map here for you. This shows the central campaign. It shows the location of Kadesh Barnea down the south near the wilderness, in the wilderness of Zin down there, and Gaza mentioned in Joshua 10:41. Gibeon would be to the northwest of Jerusalem. You can see Jerusalem's up near Jericho there, just northwest, more towards the coastal area. Now, at this point, we need a little bit of understanding for the Kerem curse. Now, previously, statements were made as to what the curse implies, but now some additional areas need to be noted. The Kerem curse was given in order to maintain the purity of Israel and to avoid the sins of the Canaanites. The purity aspect was already stressed back in chapter 5. The curse focused on ritual purity, and ritual purity concerned three things. First of all, circumcision, which we saw back in chapter 5, 2-9. Second, there was the keeping of the Passover, which we saw back in 5, 10-12. And third, we had the worship of the commander of the Lord's army, the Prince of God. And that was in 5, 13-15. Now, as to the sins of the Canaanites, these were gross sins of both idolatry and immorality. We find that in Leviticus 18, 24 to 30, Leviticus 18, 24 to 30, and Deuteronomy 9, 4 to 5. Deuteronomy 9, 4 to 5. The Canaanites were given ample opportunity to repent. Check it out in Genesis 15, 16. Genesis 15, 16. Also, those falling under the Kerem curse were limited to a specific set of tribes in a limited geographical location and a limited time. Another point to note is that the basis of the Kerem curse on the Canaanites was actually Noah's curse on the fourth son of Ham, called Canaan. When Noah made the curse in Genesis 9:25, he did not curse Ham, but said, "Cursed be Canaan." The people of Joshua dealt with the conquest of the land. The people of Joshua dealt with in the conquest of the land were the descendants of that Canaan, the son of Ham, the fourth son of Ham, actually. Now, according to Abrahamic covenant, they were given 4 whole centuries to repent. Eventually, however, they reached the point of no return when their cup of iniquity was finally full. Genesis 15:16. Instead of repenting, the Canaanites degenerated into all forms of occultism listed in Deuteronomy 18, 9 to 14. Deuteronomy 18, 9 to 14. This means that they were a spiritual threat to Israel. The book of Judges shows how great of a threat they really were. God intended to bless the world through Israel, and the Kerem curse was necessary to avoid spiritual damage to his chosen people. As the story of Rahab shows, the Canaanites had knowledge of the God of Israel and of all his powers, but failed to respond. Final note to be made regarding the Kerem curse is that God himself issued the policy of extermination, and there is no injustice with God. He has the right to punish both individuals and nations. Deuteronomy 20, 16 to 17 tells us this. Now, I'll read that for you here. Deuteronomy 20, 16 to 17. But of the cities of these peoples that Jehovah thy God gives thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive nothing that breathes, but thou shalt utterly destroy them: the Hittite, the Amorite, Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, as Jehovah thy God has commanded thee. Now in verse 43 we see the conclusion of the central campaign. It says, Joshua returned and all Israel with him onto the camp to Gilgal. This returns to the account where it left off back in verse 15. So we're going to move now to the northern campaign, which is chapter 11, verse 1 to 14. We're going to see that there'll be an alliance against Joshua here in verses 1 to 5. The Israelite victory in the southern part of Canaan alarmed the northern kings. They were worried. And in an attempt to stop the conquest, several leaders formed a confederacy. Verses 1 to 3 list the members of the alliance, with verse 1 providing its leader. And it came to pass, when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard thereof, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Achshaph. This is the same name of the king of Hazor that appears in Judges 4:2. Judges 4:2, but it can't be the same Jabin, all right? And so Jabin may have been just a dynastic name for the king of Hazor. In fact, in archaeology, they've found documents known as the Mari text, M-A-R-I text, which names the king of Hazor as Yabni Adu, Y-A-B-N-I, Adu, A-D-D-U. First part of the name of Yabni is the same as Jabin, which in Hebrew would be Yabin. So this also shows that Jabin was a dynastic name and not a personal name of the king of Hazor, but he is the leader of this northern confederacy. So after hearing about the events described in chapter 10, Jabin became the leader of the northern confederacy, and he sent word to Jobab, the king of Madon, and to the kings of Shimron and Ashpa. Now, verse 2 adds that Jabin also sent word to the kings that were on the north, that's in the hill country, and in the Arabah south of Chinneroth, and this in the lowland, and in the heights of Dor on the west. So the hill country mentioned here is Upper Galilee, and the term Arabah refers to the south side of the Sea of Galilee and the very northern part of the Jordan Valley. The lowland is Lower Galilee, and the heights of Dor are on the northern seacoast. Verse 3 adds, it says, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite on the Hermon in the land of Mizpah. So the expression here, Jebusite in the hill country, refers to a northern branch of the same tribe that held Jerusalem. And the Hivites mentioned are the one same tribe as the Gibeonites, but their territory lay further south, or further north, further north. Now, first part of verse 4 records the gathering of the kings. And they went out, and they and all their hosts with them, much people, even as the sand that is upon the seashore in multitude. Now, comparison is made between the sand and the seashore and the number of people who were part of this alliance. The idiom is used several times in Scripture. For example, in Judges 7 verse 12, Judges 7:12, it speaks of the camels of the Midianites. In 1 Samuel 13:15, 1 Samuel 13:15 refers to the Philistines. And in Jeremiah 15 verse 8, God proclaimed that he would make the widows of Israel more numerous than the sand of the seas. A similar idiom is the stars of heaven. Deuteronomy 1:10 states that God increased the population of Israel to the point that it became incomparable to the stars of heaven. In Nahum 3:16, the idiom is used in reference to the merchants of Nineveh. Second part of verse 4 notes that the members of the alliance came with horses and chariots, very many, meaning they came with an armory of horses and chariots. Remember, the Israelites didn't have that sort of stuff at this time. Verse 5 gives us the place of the battle. The meeting is, and all these kings met together, and they came and encamped together at the waters of Merom, and that purpose was to fight with Israel. In verses 6 to 9, we see the defeat of the alliance. Verse 6 to 9 record the Israelite victory over the northern alliance, beginning in verse 6 with divine instructions. It's an encouragement and a bit of an admonition here. And Jehovah said unto Joshua, be not afraid because of them. In fact, this was the same instructions given to Joshua before the attack on the Southern Confederacy. Because God says, for tomorrow at this time will I deliver them up all slain before Israel. And then come the instructions, and he lists two requirements here. Number one, you're going to hock their horses. What does that mean? It means to cut the tendon of the joint in the hind leg, and this would make them useless as war horses, but they could still be used for domesticated purposes. Second, and burn their chariots with fire. And the reason is to prevent Israel from gathering a great amount of military weapons and a large chariot force so that they lose their dependence upon God. A point made back in Deuteronomy 17:16. And then in verse 7 we have the attack. The attackers are, so Joshua came and all the people of war with him against them by the waters of Merom suddenly, and they fell upon them. So the alliance had gathered at a lake north of the Sea of Galilee called the Waters of Merom. They had assembled for the purpose of launching an attack on the Israelites. Instead, they suffered a surprise attack on their own encampment, which they obviously had not expected. And verse 8, we have the victory. And Jehovah delivered them into the hand of Israel, and they smote them and chased them onto Great Sidon, and onto Mishrepoth-maim, and onto the valley of Mizpah eastward, and they smote them until they left them none remaining. So God's role was to give the Canaanites into the hand of Israel. Israel's role was to defeat them militarily and to pursue them until no survivors were left, because that was the stipulation of the Kerem curse. And then in verse 9, we have Joshua's obedience to God's instructions. And Joshua did unto them as Jehovah bade him. He hocked their horses and burnt their chariots with fire. Good man. Now we see the conquest of Hazor and the cities of the alliance in verses 10 to 14. Now, before dealing with this section, an observation can be made here. Some commentaries on Joshua combine verses 12 to 23 of this chapter into one unit. However, Dr. Fruchtenbaum considers verses 12 to 14 to be an integral part of the discussion on the northern campaign, which is why these verses are dealt with in this section. Verse 10 to 11, he focuses on the city of Hazor, and in verse 10 is the capture of Hazor. And Joshua turned back at that time, and he took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword, for Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. So in verse 11 we have the destruction of Hazor, the population also. And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left that breathed, and he burnt Hazor with fire. And then in verse 12 we have the cities of the alliance, and all the cities of those kings, and all the kings of them did Joshua take. And he smote them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of Jehovah commanded. So first of all, we see Joshua captured the cities and their kings, and then he destroyed the population. He did so at the command of Moses. And we see the conquest of Hazor and the cities. In verse 13, we have the contrast here between the cities of the alliance and Hazor. But as for the cities that stood on their mounds, Israel burned none of them, save Hazor only. That did Joshua burn. So the Israelites only burned Hazor and left the other cities intact. However, Judges 4 shows that Hazor was quickly rebuilt and resettled by Canaanites. Therefore, the Israelites had to recapture it again. And then in verse 14, there's another distinction here concerning the spoils and the population. Because here in Hazor, and all the spoils of these cities and the cattle, the children of Israel took for a prey unto themselves. But every man they smote with the edge of the sword, until they had destroyed them, neither left them any that breathed. So while the Israelites carried off the livestock and the plunder, they completely annihilated the population of these cities. And the summary of the conquest, 15 to 23. This summarizes the conquest beginning in verse 15 with the recognition that the events fulfilled Moses' command. As Jehovah commanded Moses, his servant, so did Moses command Joshua, and so did Joshua. He left nothing undone of all that Jehovah commanded Moses. So, 3 observations can be made regarding this verse. First of all, the chain of command was from God to Moses and from Moses to Joshua. That's just what it tells us here. While Joshua's obedience was repeatedly seen, it does not mean that every command was fulfilled, since the subsequent chapter shows that much remained undone. Furthermore, contrary to God's command, a covenant was made in chapter 9 with a group of Canaanites. Remember, they got duped, they got tricked, deceived. The point is that insofar as it was in Joshua's control, he fulfilled every command of Moses, and there was no deliberate act of disobedience, not even when the covenant was made with the Gibeonites. The second observation is that the verse was written in a chiastic structure. You remember a chiasm? Chiasm says the same thing 2 different ways. Verse 15a, as Jehovah commanded Moses his servant, so did Moses command Joshua. And item B says, and so did Joshua. And then item B again says, he left nothing undone. And then of all that Jehovah commanded Moses. So it goes up, down, back to the other side. Third observation here is that whatever Joshua did, he did as a successor of Moses. And so Joshua's obedience was complete. Verses 16 to 17 deal with the territorial conquest. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country, and all the south, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel, and the lowland of the same, from Mount Halak that goes up to Mount Seir, even unto Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon under Mount Hermon. Now, list of geographical territories include 8 specific locations or regions here. First of all, the hill country. This includes the hill country of Ephraim and the hill country of Judah. We touched on it just before this. All the south, the Negev, or the land of Goshen. Well, this is not the Goshen of Egypt where they were for a couple hundred years, but the Goshen in the tribal territory of Judah. It's mentioned again in Joshua 15:51. And then we see the lowland, which is the Shephelah, the Arabah, the Jordan Valley from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, the hill country of Israel, that's the mountains of Upper Galilee and the lowland of the saints, that's the hills of Lower Galilee. And then Mount Halak, today called Jebel Halak, that goes up to Seir. So Edomite territory towards Mount Seir, the southernmost point of the conquest. Now, Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon under Mount Hermon marks the northern point of the conquest. And then verse 17b affirms the capture and execution of the kings. And all their kings he took and smote them and put them to death. It's a lot of killing, isn't it? Then verse 18 gives a statement of the duration of the conquest. Fact is that Joshua made a war a long time with all those kings. In fact, the war lasted a total of 7 years. And the book of Joshua does not list every battle and war they fought, but only the main ones. In verse 19, we have war and peace. First of all, peace. And the fact is, there was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, with the exception being, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. And then was a statement of war. They took all in battle. Now, then we see the summary of the conquest in 15 to 23. In 20. In 20, we're told about the plan of God. The divine purpose is, for it was of Jehovah to harden their hearts to come against Israel in battle, that he might utterly destroy them, that they might have no favor, but that he might destroy them as Jehovah commanded Moses. Now, by hardening this, Jehovah is hardening the enemy's hearts here. And by hardening their hearts to wage war against Israel, God fulfilled his divine purpose to destroy the Canaanites according to the command he had given to Moses. And in verses 20 and 21, we have the destruction of the Anakim. Now in verse 21, dealing with the destruction. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. So Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. Now, these were the ones, the Anakim, were the ones who so terrified the 10 spies about 40 years earlier, as recorded in Numbers 13:22, 28, 31, and 33. So virtually Numbers 13:22 to Numbers 13:33. And you'll also find it in Deuteronomy 9, verse 2. But notice that Joshua had no problem destroying them. Why? Because this is a fulfillment of the promise of Deuteronomy 9, 1 to 3. Verse 22 divides the territory of the Anakim into 3 parts. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. So in the territory that was actually conquered by Israel, all the Anakim were destroyed. And so they play no role in subsequent biblical history. However, Joshua did not take Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, and the Anakim stayed in these areas. Later on, these became Philistine cities. There are 2 observations here. While Joshua does mention the Anakim, he does not mention the Nephilim, neither here nor anywhere else in the book of Joshua. And this shows that they did not really exist. And so second, it shows that when the 10 spies mentioned seeing them in the land, they were lying. Nephilim did not survive the events of Genesis 6 and Noah's flood in Genesis 6 to 9. So the 10 spies were telling fibs, they were lying. And in verse 23, the writer concluded now the account of the conquest with a summary statement. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that Jehovah spake unto Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. And the land had rest from war. This is a general statement, okay? It's not to be understood as an absolute fact, because what will follow both in Joshua and beyond shows that there are exceptions to the general statement, which shows a great part of the land yet remaining to be conquered. This will come out in Joshua 13 and more so in Judges chapter 1. Judges chapter 1. Now, even within the conquered territory, there were pockets of Canaanite-controlled territory, such as Jerusalem and Giza. While this fact is recognized by rabbinic theology, replacement theology fails to acknowledge it. This is a rabbinic commentary. The Cincinnati commentary says this. It says the whole land. Now it says the land as a whole, though many regions remained in Canaanite hands. So they're classing it as the whole land, even though they know Canaanite regions are still there. The Masorah commentary adds, even though there were many parts of the land which were not yet conquered, Miam Loez explains that the kings mentioned above were the most important. Therefore, it was as if Joshua had conquered the entire land. In fact, the complete fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenantal promise concerning the land will not come to pass until the Messianic kingdom. That's when all the land will be Israel's. And the verse here reiterates that Joshua conquered the land on a divine basis. It ends in another summary statement saying that Joshua gave the land as an inheritance to Israel. This is the first time the Hebrew word for inheritance is used in the book of Joshua. Very first time. The term will appear 50 more times in a total of 43 verses. Why does he use it? Well, because the land is an inheritance. Why? Because it was divinely given to Israel by God. It is a divine grant. Joshua would divide the land according to the tribal divisions of the Israelites, and the statement simply summarizes what will soon follow. And the result was that the land had rest from war. Now, this statement is repeated in Joshua 14:15. So while much of the land had not yet been taken, there would be no more all-out wars to gain it. From now on, it would just be tribal battles. No full-on wars anymore, because he's conquered the main kings and main areas. So it's just going to be tribal battles from now on. Now, before leaving this chapter, 3 observations. First of all, there are basic principles concerning the holy wars in the book of Joshua. The originator of the wars was God himself. The agent of the wars was Israel, and the result of the wars was rest. Second, regarding Joshua's military strategy, it may be noted that his battles were all offensive battles. He did not wait for the enemy to come to him. Often, he used the element of surprise, and he sent his soldiers to harass the enemy in flight so that they could not regroup nor escape into their cities. So that's the second thing we see about his military strategy. And third, concerning Joshua's spiritual leadership, it can be said that he stood by the promise that was made to Rahab, although he had no role in making it. Remember, Rahab made a promise to them that she'd be kept alive and her family if they stayed in their house. Also, he kept his word to the Gibeonites, even though they got it by deception. So here, finally, he did not use his position for personal gain. He's upright. This is the mark of a good spiritual leadership. And that is your lot for today. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.